Professor Férgyiusson, is the polycrisis the word of the 21st century? It turns out that every year is unprecedented, an era with no certainties, where technology disrupts nearly everything, where a pandemic turns the world upside down, war takes place at the doorstep of Europe. Is this a reality we better get used to?
Well, you can call it a polycrisis if you like fancy words, but I just call it history. If we went back to the 1920s, I don't think we'd find the world was a calmer place. In fact, in many ways, it was a lot less calm, and Europe was a lot more unstable. So I think it's important to try to keep some historical perspective. We went through a pretty quiet phase after the end of the First Cold War. And I think that created something of an illusion that conflict was a thing of the past, that wars wouldn't happen anymore, at least not in Europe. I think this was a delusion because, of course, there was a major war in the Balkans in the 1990s, and then there were major wars in the Middle East and South Asia in the 2000s. But we sort of told ourselves that these were somehow exceptional and we'd entered a period of peace and prosperity. I think now it's clear that history has resumed and the end of history was a fantasy.
What do you think that marks as the end of this illusion? Is it maybe September 11th?
No, I don't think so, because what happened after 9/11 was that the United States exercised its apparently unchecked power and then discovered its limits. This was supposedly the unipolar era. The Soviet Union had gone and the United States was in a unique position of full spectrum dominance in military technology. And yet it turned out that it couldn't, in fact, impose its will on Afghanistan and Iraq. But I don't think that was the turning point that it seemed at the time. And in fact, at the time, I wrote a piece saying this is not the big historical turning point that you think it is, because there are more profound trends at work. And Islamic extremism is not really the major threat to American predominance. It turned out to be the rise of China, the emergence of China as an economic and technological superpower that was the really significant event. And it took Americans a long time to realize that. If anything, I think the turning point was the election of Donald Trump in 2016, because Trump had campaigned so explicitly on the China question. And there then was a really major change in American policy towards the rest of the world, and particularly towards China. So I think that was the turning point, and I think history has been on a different track since around 2016.
There's a line in your book where you focus on the importance we give to democratically elected officials, and we underestimate the power of the bureaucrats in dealing with a number of challenges, and the one you name is the recent pandemic. But what is leadership if not the virtue of inspiring the most talented and the most sophisticated to act in the better way for the common good?
In an ideal world, that's exactly what leaders are supposed to do. But if you look around you, you'll see in Europe, in North America, there are really two different kinds of leader today, with a few exceptions, and I'll come to those. There are the leaders who we might call technocrats, whose goal is to get through the week without destabilizing their precarious domestic political position. They are driven by the polling. They don't lead so much as follow. And that kind of politician has been quite common in Europe over the last 20 or 30 years. Then there are the demagogues, the Donald Trumps, the Boris Johnsons, the Narendra Modis, the people who play to the base, the political base, and who are much more interested in symbolism and rhetoric than in policy outcomes. The number of politicians who do real leadership is relatively small. Now, by real leadership, I mean you persuade your people to make short-run sacrifices to achieve long-run successes. That's, I think, the best way of thinking about leadership. And the number of leaders who can do that these days is very few. I happen to think that your Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, is one of the few serious leaders in the world today. He's consistently taken on difficult tasks and delivered success after a period when Greece was really regarded as the basket case of Europe under the previous administration. So there are exceptions to my rule, but by and large, most leaders in the democratic world are either poll-following technocrats or they're demagogues, and neither, in fact, delivers good results.
You state in your book that a new Cold War is currently taking place in the world. The 20th century's Cold War ended with the collapse of one of the two superpowers. I wonder if that is the good scenario for the current Cold War.
Well, it's difficult to know how a Cold War ends because we don't have an enormous sample size. There haven't been many Cold Wars. George Orwell defined Cold War to be a peace that is no peace. And his argument was that with the advent of atomic weapons in 1945, the great powers or superpowers wouldn't really be able to go to war directly with one another because the costs would be too high. So that first Cold War took about 40 years. And at the end of it, the American strategy of containment worked. Containment was the idea that you try to check Soviet expansionism, but then wait for the Soviet pathologies, the inner weaknesses to manifest themselves. And we're replaying containment against the People's Republic of China. It's a slightly different kind of containment. It's partly technological containment. But the goal is essentially the same, try to prevent China from expanding, trying to prevent it from becoming a technological equal to the United States, and then waiting for the inner pathologies of a one-party state to manifest themselves. I don't think it's a bad strategy. I think, in fact, it's a much better strategy than risking confrontation and hot war. So I've been arguing since 2018 that we're in Cold War II, and my argument is, don't panic. That's actually a much better outcome than World War III.
We're currently intimidated by Putin and his threats to escalate into a nuclear war, but are we really underestimating the Chinese nuclear power capabilities?
Well, there are 2 points to make here. One is that in basic deterrence theory, I thought we'd learnt that in the Cold War, you don't allow a Russian leader to do what Putin is doing. When Putin first began to threaten to use nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine, our response should have been, fine, we have them too. If you use them, we'll use them on you, just to be clear. That was how we responded to nuclear threats during the first Cold War. And I find it bizarre that American policymakers have forgotten this. If you don't do that, if you allow the Russian leader to make those threats and essentially back away, then you've given him escalation dominance. The second point is the Chinese role. Without China, the Russian war effort would have fallen apart long ago. Massive Chinese supplies of dual-use equipment are what keep the Russian war machine going. And so we shouldn't pretend that China is neutral. It's not. It has backed Putin from the outset in this conflict. Meanwhile, China has embarked on a massive rearmament program, or armament program, I should say, because it's building weapons it never had before, including a huge nuclear arsenal, as well as a great many non-nuclear missiles that can sink, say, American aircraft carriers. So there is another threat, in addition to the Russian threat, that the West has to contend with. And that's the much more formidable Chinese threat, more formidable because China's economy is much, much larger than Russia's, and therefore it has vastly more resources available to develop weapon systems.
Talking about China, do you still believe that the COVID pandemic initiated in a Chinese laboratory and we still don't have a good understanding of what really caused it?
Well, at the time, I was skeptical about the so-called wet market theory. And all the evidence that's come out since 2020 has tended to support the alternative theory that the virus originated in one of the laboratories in Wuhan that were doing research into coronaviruses. I don't say the virus was engineered, that's a different point. I think the virus was a natural virus that was leaked from that lab, but we can't know for certain because, of course, the Chinese authorities have never cooperated in a serious investigation into the origins of the pandemic. On the contrary, they've lied about it. And they've suppressed the evidence, including the evidence from Chinese scientists. So we can't know for certain. I just think there's very good reason to be wary of the official explanation when a government has been as obviously mendacious and the cover-up has been so carefully concerted as in this case.
Professor Férgyiusson, what would you name as the single most dangerous threat the world is currently facing?
Nuclear war, I think, has to be the most dangerous threat. That's been true, really, since the 1960s. because since the 1960s, we have possessed sufficient nuclear warheads to cause absolutely massive damage to the planet and the human race. And so when people talk about other threats, the one that they love to talk about is climate change. I respond that climate change is a serious issue, but it's relatively slow moving compared with the nuclear missile. If there were to be a nuclear war, there would be an instantaneous change in the nature of life on Earth. And that's the thing that I think we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about. I've read 100 articles about climate change for every one that I've read in the past 5 years about China's nuclear weapons program.
Do you sense that cyber terrorism will cause more pain in the future than actual terrorism has caused in the West in the last 50 years?
Well, I don't think that cyber terrorism is quite the right term to use, because what really goes on the internet is crime rather than terrorism. All kinds of crimes are committed online that we don't hear about because very few corporations want to admit when they've been hacked, when data has been stolen or systems have been compromised. So cybercrime is on a much larger scale than most of us realize until we ourselves are victims of it. A friend of mine, an eminent economist, just a few weeks ago, had his entire online life hacked by criminals who took control of his telephone number and were able to access everything from his bank accounts through his social media to his email. That's the real problem. And I don't think we are fully cognizant of how serious and widespread it is. And most of us don't take nearly enough care to protect our online data. So that's the issue. Terrorism has diminished in Europe and it's diminished in North America relative to the decade or so after 9/11. That's partly because security services have done a pretty good job of breaking up Islamist networks. But the problem hasn't gone away. It's just relocated to places where security services are much weaker. That's why you get a lot more Islamist violence in Africa now than you do in Europe.
Here in Europe, we tend to identify two major issues for the rise of the ultra-right. One is the increasing inequalities, and the second one is immigration. I wonder if you sense the same two reasons apply also in the United States.
Well, in many ways, the issue of inequality is a bigger one in the United States because the income and wealth disparities are quite a bit bigger than in Europe, and the US welfare system is a very inefficient way of reducing those inequalities. The immigration issue is more important, I think, if one's trying to explain why far-right parties do well and why a candidate like Donald Trump is back in business in 2024. In the United States, there has been essentially 4 years of chaos on the southern border of the United States because the Biden administration has not been serious about restricting illegal flows of people across that border. And that's handed Donald Trump an extremely strong card in this election poker game. In Europe, after a brief dip during the pandemic, flows of migrants across the Mediterranean and from the east have increased, and they will continue to increase in future years because it's extremely difficult to stop, and because the incentives remain very powerful for people in North Africa or the Near East to try to seek better economic opportunities in Europe. So I think the migration issue is a more powerful driver of far-right politics. And that's partly because mainstream politicians have by and large not offered good solutions to this problem. And the public understandably feels uneasy about uncontrolled flows. I don't think European publics are hostile to legal immigration in quite the same way, and it's equally true in the United States. The issue is illegal, unregulated immigration, and citizens, I think, reasonably feel that their governments should be able to control borders and decide who comes into their country and do it on a legal basis.
To that end, how do you think leaders of the traditional right should approach this situation? Should they partly buy into the arguments of the radical right, or should they emerge as a moderate alternative and also find solutions like the one you just mentioned?
Well, it's clear that there are practical solutions, and they shouldn't be monopolized by the far right. It's clear that we should be able to police the borders of our countries better than we do. And technology, in fact, makes this easier than it has been 20 years ago. I think it's not controversial to say that we need some immigration, because if you look at fertility rates and the aging populations of Europe, the alternative is economic stagnation. So there clearly has to be some migration, but it needs to be regulated. And clearly one wants to have some choice about who comes and who doesn't come. So this shouldn't really be controversial. I don't see why Social Democrats would be opposed to that position. And indeed, in some countries in Scandinavia, Social Democrats have embraced that kind of argument. The reality is that letting the far right have a monopoly on this issue was a major mistake that centrists on both the left and the right made. And now they have to acknowledge that citizens have a legitimate right to secure borders and legal, not illegal immigration, and deliver that. And if they don't deliver it, then obviously other politicians will get elected. I think this is a straightforward issue that people overthink. And I think they overthink it partly because of the very wrong view that if you're against illegal immigration, you must be some kind of racist. But I don't think there's anything progressive about open borders and unregulated migration. And those who are in favor of open borders, by and large, are not the people affected by illegal immigration. They're people who live in cities, in the elite neighborhoods, and they can afford their progressive politics because they don't have to live with the consequences of healthcare systems and housing systems that are overwhelmed by inflows from other countries.
Is Trump on its way to the White House next November? And is this bad news for Europe?
Well, first, it's very hard to predict this election. It's going to be as close as all the recent elections. It's going to be decided in a few counties in about 5 states. And so ultimately, voting decisions by a few 100,000 people will decide whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump who gets reelected. I think if I had to make a prediction right now, it would be that Joe Biden is narrowly reelected. And that's because of 2 things, really. First, all the legal problems that Donald Trump faces, in particular the criminal cases against him, are a real headwind. And if one of those cases produces a criminal conviction before November the 5th, I think it will really hurt Trump with independent voters, with the floating voters in the middle, who ultimately will be key to the outcome. I also think that Trump is making a succession of unforced errors on the campaign trail, saying things that really will play very badly as the election gets closer. And I'll just give you one example. The other day, he said in an interview that he was in favor of cuts in Medicare and Social Security. Well, that's what cost Mitt Romney the 2012 election. And I think the Biden team is planning on running a very 2012 campaign in which they will focus on Trump's defects. And that will probably be enough. But it's going to be close. And I don't have high confidence in that prediction. As to Europe, well, Europeans always overreact when a Republican is elected. They had a very negative view, I can remember this, of Ronald Reagan, one of the greatest American presidents of the past century. They have a very negative view still of George W. Bush. They have, of course, an extremely negative view of Donald Trump. And if you look at polling, the extraordinary way in which Europeans reacted to the Trump presidency would lead you to think that the end of the Republic had arrived. But of course, the Trump presidency came and went. It was, in fact, not the disaster that Europeans feared. The Trump economic policies were very successful. Trump's foreign policy was actually very successful too. And the Biden administration's foreign policy has been a great deal worse. And so Europeans really have not benefited from Joe Biden's being elected. To think only of 2 things. The Biden administration really failed to deter Putin from invading Ukraine. I'm not sure that would have happened if Trump had been re-elected. And with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration embarked on an industrial policy that clearly hurts European businesses. So I don't know why Europeans are so inclined to hate on Donald Trump and love Joe Biden. Biden's actually been quite a bit worse for Europe than Trump was.
In the Ukraine front, there was a united initial response to the invasion, but now support is wavering. How do you see this story evolving?
Well, 2 years ago, it was easy to predict that if the war lasted this long, that Western unity would fray. Americans would lose interest, which they have, particularly Republicans, and Europeans would start to worry about the cost of the war, which, of course, is what is happening. I think it was a grave error not to try to end this war sooner. And I think there were opportunities to do that were squandered. In the period when people in the US and Europe deluded themselves that Ukraine was going to win a famous victory. And that period in 2023, I think, gave rise to an exaggerated expectation of what Ukraine's offensive last year could achieve. Now we're really stuck because the war is grinding on. Russia shows no sign of losing. And of course, without American support, the Ukrainian army is short of ammunition. It's very hard to hold an extended front line if you don't have ammunition. But all of this was easily predictable. In fact, it was one of the easiest predictions I made in 2022, that if the war was protracted, Western support would fray. And Russia has a long record of starting wars very badly indeed, and then ultimately grinding out victory. War against Finland, the so-called Winter War, and of course, World War II. So this was very predictable, and Western leaders should have understood that they had a limited window of time when their publics would be strongly supportive, and therefore allowing the war to drag on was, I think, a major strategic error. And it was unnecessary because there were those people who argued in 2022 and 2023, this is good because we're causing the Russians to bleed their military dry, but the Ukrainians are doing the fighting and all we have to do is write checks. Great. But that argument was really short-sighted, and it failed to see that ultimately Russia has greater resources than Ukraine does, and therefore has a decent chance of grinding out a victory over a 3 or 4 year time frame. Well, there's always a way out of wars. They don't go on forever. The question is, which one do we choose? We can foolishly leave the Ukrainians in the lurch and allow Russia to win. That's an option. It's the stupid option. A preferable option is clearly to increase support for Ukraine, make it clear to the Russians that they can't, in fact, win this war at a tolerable cost. And that has to be the right way to go. And I exhort American lawmakers as well as European voters and politicians, don't stop supporting Ukraine now. This is the critical moment in the war. I think the war will probably last another year at least. But as long as Ukraine can keep up the fight and make it impossible for Russia to make any further gains, then at some point, I think Russia and Ukraine will have to negotiate at least an armistice. Bear in mind, the Ukrainians have won the war at sea. They've inflicted extraordinary heavy damage on the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. So one shouldn't say that the Ukraine is losing this war. It's not. But if we don't support them, as we've done up until now, then I think there is a risk that they lose it. And that will end up costing Europe far, far more than the cost of supporting Ukraine for another year of fighting.
Professor Férγκιουσον, are you in a position to calculate the socioeconomic risk associated with the AI revolution? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I'm surrounded by optimists here in California, and my response is to point out the historical reasons to be a pessimist. It's artificial general intelligence that we should worry about. Artificial intelligence has been around for a while, and it mostly provides relatively efficient solutions to limited tasks. The question is whether by increasing the compute exponentially for a few more years, we get to artificial general intelligence. That is something that is equal to human intelligence. That is what Sam Altman of OpenAI wants to achieve. And I think that's the really dangerous thing. So I'd be very wary of the effort to achieve AGI. And secondly, I'd remind you that when humans get a new technology, and large language models at this scale are clearly a new technology, they do tend to use it for bad things as well as good. Ask yourself, after the discovery of nuclear fission, which did we build more of? Nuclear power stations or nuclear warheads? The answer, of course, is warheads. And I think most people today underestimate the ways in which artificial intelligence will be used for negative and destructive purposes. And as long as we make that mistake, we're going to run into serious unintended trouble. So I welcome the beneficial effects of AI, particularly in medical science. DeepMind's AlphaFold is a miraculous achievement, but I think we're underestimating the ways in which AI can be weaponized and the dangers of creating artificial general intelligence, something that is as clever as us and potentially more clever. That, I think, would be a very, very grave mistake.